Good afternoon, my name is Margaret Clarke and I'm branch secretary from the Asda A15 branch. Today my presentation is based on the film Made in Dagenham. Hopefully I will be able to give you an insight into the reasons why the women went on strike and the impact that it has on us today. The women that worked at the Ford factory were sewing machinists that made seat covers. They walked out as part of the regrading exercise when they were informed that their jobs were graded into category B. That was the less skilled production jobs, instead of category C, which was the more skilled production jobs, and they would be paid 15% less than the full B rate received by men. At the time, it was common practice for companies to pay women less than men, irrespective of the skills involved. The strike was led by Rose Boland, Eileen Pullen, Vera Syme, Gwen Davies and Sheila Douglas. It began on the 7th of June 1968. The strike had enormous consequences for all working women, and it led directly to the passing of the Equal Pay Act 2 years later. The weeks of the strike were a time of tension and hardship. Many of the women's husbands worked at Ford's, and not all of them supported a strike which may lead them to being laid off. But there was fun too. Lil Grisley remembers marching in London with a banner declaring, "We want sex equality." And she wondered why she was getting so many hoots from passing lorry drivers. And then she realised that the last word was missing, so it read, "We want sex." But on a more serious note, following the intervention of Barbara Castle, the Secretary of State for Employment and Productivity in Harold Wilson's government, the strike ended 3 weeks after it began, as a result of a deal that immediately increased their rate of pay to 8% below that of men, rising to the full category B rate the following year. A court inquiry under the Industrial Court Acts 1919 was also set up to consider their regrading, although this failed to find in their favour. The women were only regraded into category C following a further 6-week strike in 1984. That was the second strike, where they took action against the regrading system. A decision in their favour by an independent arbitration panel. The company agreed to regrade the women. When the women from Ford's met with Barbara Castle, it was a massive occasion for all concerned. Barbara Castle had to persuade Harold Wilson to agree to the structure of the regrading. She realised the consequences if this did not happen, so she got Harold Wilson to agree to this. With the success of this meeting, the women drank sherry with Barbara Castle and celebrated their victory. In the Ford strike, the women never realised just how much power they had until they brought the factory to a standstill when there were no more seat covers left. The factory ground to a halt, the Ford empire down on its knees. Going back now to the first strike, the strike actions led to the advent of the Equal Pay Act. Poor factory conditions and long hours, their journey accounts for their struggle that began in the 19th century. Women who worked in segregated areas of employment, cleaning, catering, cooking and sewing machinists, were always paid the same work for a fraction of the male rate. The Equal Pay Act 1970 prevents discrimination between male and female employees in the same job in relation to pay and terms and conditions. It introduced the concept of equal pay for work of equal value. Equal Pay Act 1970 prevents that discrimination. 16 years later, they were still waiting for the equal pay. In 1984, the unions wanted to do away with the test that you had to take before they employed you at Ford's. The point the unions were making was, why should there be a test when Ford's clearly don't see this as a skilled job? So that was a very, very important point. When the women ran out of work, they were put on other departments like the door panels or work in the tank shops. But the men were never asked to go on other departments because they quite simply could not do the work. So the fight continues. The film Made in Dagenham also portrayed the way women were expected to behave, in the way that the little woman should always be at home, doing the dishes, cooking the meal, looking after the children. And it was really obvious in that film. And also the educational side of things. There was a boss, his wife had got a degree that she did nothing at all with because he never encouraged her or he didn't see it of any value at all. So, to conclude, the film's message on women's ability to overcome a culture that promotes sex discrimination is still as relevant today as it was then. The women of Dagenham may have won their fight, but the fight continues for the rest of us today. The strike was one of the most important since the Match Girl strike of 1888. It was the spark that lit the flame that burns to this day. Their struggle remains an inspiration to millions of women fighting discrimination and poor working conditions. Albert Passingham, who was played by Bob Hawkins, the union organiser in the film, he offered one of the most poignant observations in the film, a quote from Marx. Progress can be measured by the social positions of the female sex. I leave you with that thought and thank you for listening. Thank you.